Hollywood has always sparkled with fame, fortune, and flashing lights. But behind the glamour, plenty of stars had a not-so-secret love affair with alcohol. Some made drinking part of their persona, others battled it behind the scenes, and a few let it destroy them completely. Today, we're counting down 25 Hollywood stars who were always drunk, with outrageous stories, unbelievable moments, and some truly tragic endings. So grab your popcorn, or maybe a stiff drink, and let's dive in.
Terribly sorry.
It's okay, I was scared it was sweet soup. You won't tell anybody, will you?
Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart wasn't just the tough guy from Casablanca. He lived that role every single day, usually with a glass of scotch in hand. Off-screen, Bogey was the life of Hollywood's drinking scene. In fact, he founded the very first Rat Pack, years before Frank Sinatra made it famous. A crew of hard-drinking, hard-living stars who turned all-night benders into an art form. Bogart was rarely seen without a drink, and he leaned into the reputation. Once, when asked about sobriety, he joked that the worst day of his life was the one time he tried to give up alcohol. That's how committed he was. But the lifestyle caught up with him. In 1957, after a long battle with esophageal cancer, Bogart's legendary wit showed up, even at the end. His final words? "I should have switched to martinis." That's classic Bogey, Hollywood's ultimate tough guy, on screen and off. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn wasn't just Hollywood's favorite swashbuckler on screen. He lived like a real pirate off camera. Famous for his role in Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood, Flynn turned his love for adventure into a wild lifestyle. His yacht, the Zaka, wasn't just a boat. It was a floating nightclub packed with booze, women, and non-stop parties that could last for days. Rum was his drink of choice, but Flynn never discriminated when it came to alcohol or trouble. One of the most infamous stories, he partied in Havana with a young Fidel Castro, trading shots of rum and swapping war stories like old comrades. But the years of hard living took their toll. By his 50s, Flynn's once dashing looks were ravaged by drink and excess. In 1959, while in Vancouver, he died suddenly at just 50 years old. Doctors said his body was like that of an 80-year-old man. Still, Flynn's legend lives on, not just as Hollywood's greatest rogue, but as the actor who truly blurred the line between the characters he played and the life he lived. W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields was one of Hollywood's greatest comedians and one of its greatest drunks. That trademark red nose? It wasn't makeup. Fields started most days with gin, and during Prohibition, he stockpiled a private collection of more than 7,000 bottles just to make sure he never ran dry. On movie sets, he was rarely without his trusty flask, disguised with a label that read pineapple juice. Everyone knew what was really inside, and directors often had to shoot around his drinking. Still, Fields leaned into the image, weaving booze into his routines and building an entire comedy persona out of being hilariously intoxicated. But behind the laughs was a darker story. By the 1940s, his health was collapsing from years of heavy drinking. When he died in 1946, he left behind not just classic films, but a cautionary tale of a man who turned alcohol into both his greatest punchline and his ultimate downfall. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was one of Hollywood's greatest actors, a two-time Oscar winner and the star of classics like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. But off-screen, he was a studio's worst nightmare. Tracy was a lifelong alcoholic, and his binges were so legendary that MGM literally created a Tracy squad, whose only job was to track him down, sober him up, and drag him back to set. His drinking often spiraled into violence. On one infamous bender, he even punched a police officer, an incident that would have ended most careers. But this was the golden age of Hollywood, and MGM covered up to protect their star. Behind the scenes, alcohol wrecked Tracy's personal life. His marriage collapsed, and his long-term relationship with Katharine Hepburn was constantly strained by his drinking and health problems. By the time he died in 1967, at just 67 years old, years of hard living had left him physically broken. Still, Tracy remains remembered as a genius on screen, and a tragic example of how even the brightest stars can burn themselves out. Peter O'Toole wasn't just the star of Lawrence of Arabia. He was also one of Hollywood's most legendary drinkers. His wild reputation followed him everywhere. Once, after an all-night bender, he got so drunk he actually bought a pub, and then completely forgot he owned it the next day. Another time in Ireland, he managed to sink a boat while drinking on board, and laughed it off as if it were just another night out. O'Toole himself drew a sharp line about his habits. "I'm not a drunk," he famously declared. "I'm a drinker," and drink he did, often alongside fellow hard-livers like Richard Burton, Richard Harris, and Oliver Reed. Together, they were known for marathon pub crawls that became the stuff of legend. But the lifestyle caught up with him. In the 1970s, doctors removed much of his stomach after years of damage, forcing him to slow down. Even then, he never quite gave up the bottle. When he died in 2013 at age 81, he left behind not just iconic films, but a reputation as one of the last great hell-raisers of Hollywood. Judy Garland. Judy Garland may have been the beloved star of The Wizard of Oz, but behind the music and the magic was a tragic story. From the time she was a child, MGM executives fed her pills, uppers to keep her working, downers to make her sleep. It was the beginning of a cycle of addiction she would battle for the rest of her life. As she grew older, Garland turned to alcohol. Her favorite was champagne, as a way to numb the pressure of fame. But it only made things worse. Her drinking led to public breakdowns, humiliating stumbles on stage, and a string of failed marriages. Still, whenever she sang, the world saw the same radiant star who had once dreamed of life over the rainbow. By 1969, her body couldn't take it anymore. At just 47 years old, Judy Garland died in London from the toxic combination of alcohol and barbiturates. Her death was a devastating loss, but her legacy as one of Hollywood's greatest voices and one of its most tragic cautionary tales lives on. Dean Martin. Dean Martin perfected the image of Hollywood's smoothest drunk. With a scotch glass always in hand and a lazy grin, he built his entire brand around looking half-lit. On stage, he'd stumble, slur his words, and crack jokes that made audiences roar. The secret? Sometimes that scotch was just apple juice. But don't be fooled. Off stage, Martin definitely enjoyed the real thing. In Las Vegas, his nights with Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and the rest of the Rat Pack became the stuff of legend. Together, they turned the Strip into their playground, mixing booze, music, and mischief until dawn. But behind the charm, Dean had his private demons. Family members later revealed that when he wasn't performing, Martin went on heavy drinking binges far away from the spotlight. As he got older, Martin slowed down, retreating from the wild Vegas lifestyle. Yet the image stuck. To the world, he would always be the cool, cocktail-sipping crooner, Hollywood's ultimate lounge king, who made being drunk look like an art form. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just Hollywood royalty. She was Hollywood excess personified. Famous for her love of diamonds and drama, she was equally devoted to her vodka tonics, which flowed freely at the legendary parties she threw. One night, after one too many, she famously tossed a massive diamond ring into the pool, just to prove she could. That was Liz, glamorous, reckless, and unforgettable. Alcohol was often at the center of her roller coaster personal life. Her 8 marriages, most infamously to Richard Burton, were fueled by booze, passion, and epic fights that made headlines worldwide. The two were known for their volcanic rows, often sparked during their drinking sessions, and their love affair became as famous as their films. By the 1980s, though, Taylor's drinking had spiraled out of control, and she shocked the world by becoming one of the first major celebrities to publicly enter rehab. That brave step helped break the stigma around addiction in Hollywood. When she passed away in 2011, Elizabeth Taylor was remembered not just as one of the most beautiful stars of all time, but as a woman who battled her demons as fiercely as she lived her life. Richard Burton. Richard Burton wasn't just Elizabeth Taylor's great love. He was also one of Hollywood's greatest drinkers. Known for his booming voice and magnetic presence, Burton could down alcohol like few others. 3 bottles of vodka a day was his normal pace, and he treated drinking contests like a sport. In one legendary story, He walked into a pub full of sailors and outranked every single one of them. But Burton wasn't just a reckless drinker. He was deeply self-aware. He often admitted he drank to quiet what he called his restless mind. Alcohol fueled both his brilliance and his destruction, carrying him through Shakespearean roles and blockbuster films while tearing apart his health and marriages. His on-again, off-again relationship with Elizabeth Taylor was a storm of passion, fueled by booze, fights, and makeups that fascinated the world. By the 1980s, though, his body had given up. Years of excess left his liver destroyed, and in 1984 he died suddenly at just 58. Taylor later said Burton drank not to celebrate life, but to escape it. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic part of his story. Behind the legend of excess was a man searching for peace he never found. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, OL Blue Eyes, wasn't just the chairman of the board. He was the king of the cocktail. His drink of choice? Jack Daniel's on the rocks. He loved it so much he was even buried with a bottle in his coffin. Sinatra once quipped, "I feel sorry for people who don't drink. When they wake up, that's the best they'll feel all day." That pretty much summed up his philosophy. In Las Vegas, Sinatra and the Rat Pack rewrote the rules of nightlife. Their parties were wild, boozy marathons where broken glasses, trashed hotel suites, and even golf carts ending up in fountains were all part of the fun. And because Sinatra was Sinatra, no matter how bad things got, the casinos and studios always cleaned up after him. But behind the glamour, the drinking took its toll. Friends said Sinatra could be charming one minute and explosive the next, his moods shifting with the level in his glass. Still, he never slowed down. Right up until his death in 1998, Jack Daniel's remained his constant companion. So much so that the whiskey brand is forever linked to his name. For Sinatra, drinking wasn't a vice, it was part of the legend. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was the very definition of Hollywood glamour and Hollywood trouble. Known for her stunning looks and fiery spirit, she had a favorite fuel, tequila. Gardner drank it like water, and when mixed with her temper, the results could be explosive. At one party, after one too many, she famously punched a reporter square in the face, cementing her reputation as someone you did not want to cross. Her drinking went hand in hand with her wild personal life. Gardner's stormy romances with men like Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and especially Frank Sinatra kept her in the headlines almost as much as her films. Friends said she was never afraid to speak her mind, and with a drink in hand, her sharp wit only got sharper. But unlike many stars of her era, Gardner never tried to hide her habits. She admitted openly that alcohol fueled her rebellious streak, saying it gave her the freedom to live on her own terms. By the time she passed away in 1990, she had outlived most of her hard-drinking peers, leaving behind the image of a woman who refused to play by anyone's rules but her own. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was once the biggest star in the world. By the late 1930s, he was Hollywood's top box office draw. But fame that intense, that young, came with a heavy price. As he grew older, Rooney turned to whiskey to handle the pressure, and his drinking soon became as notorious as his talent. Benders wrecked his personal life. Rooney was married 8 times, and alcohol was a constant fuel for the blow-ups, fights, and heartbreaks. He also developed a reputation for barroom brawls, where his small size didn't stop him from picking or finishing a fight after a few too many. Studios spent years covering up his scandals, desperate to protect one of their most bankable stars. Yet through all the chaos, Rooney never stopped working. His career spanned over 9 decades, from Andy Hardy in the 1930s to roles well into the 2000s. That resilience kept him in the spotlight, even as alcohol haunted him throughout his life. When he passed away in 2014 at the age of 93, he left behind not just a mountain of films, but the story of a man who could never fully escape the shadow of the bottle. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, an Oscar-winning actress and a reigning queen of MGM. But behind the sharp glamour and perfectly arched eyebrows was a woman who rarely let go of her glass of vodka. On set, she often sipped it like water, keeping herself composed but never truly sober. Crawford's drinking became inseparable from her legacy after the release of Mommy Dearest, the infamous memoir written by her daughter, Christina. The book painted her as an abusive, rage-filled drunk, screaming over wire hangers and terrifying her children. To this day, debate rages over how much of it was true, but the stories stuck, and they've colored her reputation ever since. Still, Crawford never let alcohol derail her career. She reinvented herself again and again, from 1920s flapper to 1940s dramatic powerhouse to 1960s horror queen in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. But by the 1970s, years of drinking and isolation had taken their toll. When she died in 1977, she left behind one of Hollywood's most complicated legacies, a star who lived on vodka on her own terms, and whose legend, scandal and all, refuses to fade. John Barrymore. John Barrymore, nicknamed the Great Profile for his chiseled looks, was one of Hollywood's first true superstars. But he was also one of its greatest drinkers. By the 1930s, his alcoholism was legendary. On film sets, he'd slur through lines, forget entire scenes, or collapse in the middle of takes. Directors often had to shoot around his condition just to finish a movie. His stage career fared no better. Once, during a live performance, Barrymore stumbled so badly he fell right off the stage. The audience roared with laughter, thinking it was part of the act, but it wasn't. That was the tragic reality of a man being slowly consumed by the bottle. Off-screen, his binges were equally infamous. Friends described nights where Barrymore could drain entire cases of whiskey, then charm everyone in the room with stories and wit. But the excess caught up fast. By the early 1940s, his once matinee idol looks were ravaged, and his health was destroyed. He died in 1942 at just 60 years old, a fallen legend whose brilliance was eclipsed by his addiction. Bette Davis. Bette Davis wasn't just one of the greatest actresses of all time. She was also one of Hollywood's toughest personalities. With a martini in one hand and a cigarette in the other, Davis ruled the screen and the party scene with equal fire. She loved her cocktails almost as much as she loved the good feud, and she had plenty, sparring with rivals like Joan Crawford both on and off set. Her drinking often added fuel to the drama. At parties, Davis could be the center of attention, sharp-tongued, magnetic, and unstoppable. One famous incident saw her dancing on a table after too many martinis, only to crash spectacularly to the floor. Instead of embarrassment, Davis brushed it off with the same defiance that defined her career. She smoked and drank heavily her entire life, habits that eventually took a toll on her health. But unlike many stars, Davis never apologized for the way she lived. Fierce, blunt, and utterly uncompromising, she remained unapologetic about her vices until her death in 1989. Bette Davis wasn't just a star, she was a storm, and the martini glass was always part of her legend. Robert Downey Jr. Before he became Iron Man and one of the most bankable stars in the world, Robert Downey Jr. was Hollywood's ultimate cautionary tale. In the 1990s, his drinking and drug use spiraled completely out of control. He racked up arrests for DUI, drug possession, and probation violations, spending nights in jail and even stints in rehab that never seemed to stick. Downey's binges became infamous. He admitted to waking up in strangers' houses after blackouts, including one time when he passed out in a child's bed after wandering into the wrong home. Studios stopped insuring him, directors dropped him, and his once promising career looked over before it had truly begun. But Downey's story didn't end there. After finally getting sober in the early 2000s, with the support of his family and sheer determination, he rebuilt himself piece by piece. In 2008, Marvel took a gamble casting him as Tony Stark in Iron Man, a role that not only mirrored his struggles with addiction, but also launched one of the biggest comebacks in film history. Today, Robert Downey Jr. isn't remembered as the man who lost it all. He's remembered as the man who fought back and won, turning his darkest years into the foundation of one of Hollywood's greatest redemption stories. Brendan Fraser. Brendan Fraser was once the charming action hero of the 1990s, leading hits like The Mummy and George of the Jungle. But behind the smiles and adventurous roles, Fraser faced years of personal and professional turmoil. After a painful divorce, the death of his mother, and serious injuries from years of stunt work, he quietly turned to alcohol for comfort. Unlike some stars, his struggles weren't splashed across tabloids, but they left him isolated, withdrawn, and largely absent from the Hollywood spotlight. For more than a decade, Fraser lived in near obscurity, his career stalling while he battled grief, health issues, and the weight of addiction. Fans who grew up watching him feared he'd been lost to Hollywood's dark side forever. But Fraser fought back. With the support of his family and sheer resilience, he pulled himself out of isolation. In 2022, his deeply moving performance in The Whale reignited his career, and his emotional acceptance speech at the 2023 Oscars, where he won Best Actor, showed the world a man who had not only survived but triumphed. Brendan Fraser's story isn't about scandal, it's about survival. A reminder that even in Hollywood, comebacks are possible, and sometimes the quietest battles lead to the loudest victories. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood was one of Hollywood's most beloved stars, captivating audiences in films like Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story. Off-screen, she loved her wine and martinis, often enjoying long, boozy evenings with friends. But her story doesn't just end in alcohol. It ends in one of Hollywood's greatest mysteries. In November 1981, Wood was aboard her yacht, the Splendor, with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken. After hours of heavy drinking and heated arguments, she somehow ended up in the dark waters off Catalina Island. Her body was found the next morning, and her death was ruled an accidental drowning. But the details never added up. Witnesses reported shouting, a missing dinghy, and conflicting stories from those on board. Over the years, the case has been reopened, with Wagner even named a person of interest. Yet the truth of what really happened that night remains unresolved. Natalie Wood's legacy is twofold: a radiant actress whose talent lit up the screen, and a tragic figure whose final moments are still shrouded in suspicion, making her death one of Hollywood's most enduring scandals. Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby was the voice of a generation, the smooth crooner behind White Christmas, and one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. But behind his calm, easygoing image was a man who drank steadily, often keeping a glass of bourbon within reach all day. Unlike the public antics of other Hollywood drinkers, Crosby's drinking was quieter, hidden behind his wholesome persona. On stage and screen, he was the picture of warmth and charm. But at home, his family later painted a much darker picture. His sons revealed that when Crosby drank too much, he could be cold, controlling, and sometimes cruel, especially toward them. The revelations shocked fans who had only ever seen America's Dad. Crosby himself never acknowledged a problem, and studios worked hard to protect his spotless image. He continued to perform, record, and golf right up until his final years. In 1977, he died suddenly of a heart attack on a golf course in Spain, leaving behind a legacy of timeless music, but also the more complicated truth that only came out later. Bing Crosby remains a cultural icon, but his story shows how even the smoothest stars could hide rougher realities behind the spotlight. Oliver Reed. Oliver Reed was larger than life, on screen and off. Known for his booming voice and imposing presence in films like Gladiator and Oliver, he was just as famous for his drinking. Reed's barroom exploits were the stuff of legend. One story claims he once downed 106 pints of beer in just a single weekend. Another time, he supposedly drank a London pub completely dry, leaving bartenders scrambling for more kegs. Reed treated drinking like a competitive sport, often taking on locals in challenges wherever he traveled. He could knock back pint after pint of beer, chase it with whiskey or rum, and still charm the room with bawdy jokes and outrageous stories. His drinking buddies included fellow Hellraisers like Richard Burton and Richard Harris, and together they built reputations as unstoppable forces of excess. But in 1999, while filming Gladiator in Malta, Reed's drinking finally caught up with him. During a night at a local bar, he accepted a challenge to drink glass after glass of rum with a group of sailors. Reed won the contest, but soon after collapsed from a massive heart attack and died at 61. Oliver Reed literally drank until the end, leaving behind a legacy as one of Hollywood's most unapologetic hellraisers. And there you have it, 25 Hollywood stars who drank their way into history for better or worse. Some turned it into a persona, others lost everything to it, and a few managed a comeback. Which story shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more wild Hollywood stories. Until next time, stay awesome. Clark Gable. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, the man who made audiences swoon in Gone with the Wind, was every bit the rugged leading man on screen. Off-screen, though, he relied heavily on whiskey. Gable was a steady drinker throughout his life, but tragedy turned that habit into something darker. In 1942, his beloved wife, Carole Lombard, one of the brightest stars of the era, was killed in a plane crash while returning from a war bonds tour. The loss devastated Gable. Friends said he never truly recovered, retreating from the world and drowning his grief in endless bottles. He drank alone, using alcohol as both company and escape, and his once playful spirit dimmed. Despite the drinking, Gable kept working, starring in war films and later opposite Marilyn Monroe in Misfits. But the years of alcohol and hard living took their toll. In 1960, at just 59, he died of a heart attack, leaving Hollywood without its king. To the public, Clark Gable will always be the dashing Rhett Butler. But behind the charm was a man who lived and drank with a broken heart. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was the ultimate Hollywood icon, radiant, playful, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. But behind the dazzling image, she leaned heavily on champagne and pills to cope with the crushing pressure of fame. On set, her drinking and drug use often left her late, scattered, or unable to remember lines, driving directors and co-stars to frustration, even as audiences adored her. Off camera, Marilyn's habits became even more reckless. At parties, she was the life of the room one moment and passed out in a corner, or even a closet, the next. Friends worried about her, but Monroe brushed it off with charm, insisting champagne helped her relax when the world felt overwhelming. Her troubled marriages to Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller only deepened her struggles, and Hollywood's relentless demands left her isolated. By the early 1960s, the mix of alcohol and barbiturates had become a dangerous crutch. In 1962, at just 36 years old, she was found dead in her Brentwood home, a tragic ending forever tied to the toxic cocktail of pills and booze. Marilyn Monroe remains immortal on screen, but behind the sparkle was a woman undone by the very escape she relied on. Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp's most famous role may be Captain Jack Sparrow, but for years the rum-loving pirate wasn't far from reality. Depp developed a reputation as one of Hollywood's true hellraisers, fueled by rum, whiskey, and his friendships with counterculture icons like Hunter S. Thompson. Together, they tore through bars, clubs, and late-night writing sessions that often ended in chaos. In his younger days, Depp left a trail of destruction, literally. He once trashed a New York hotel suite so badly it made headlines, earning him a spot among Hollywood's wildest partiers. He bounced between film sets, rock concerts, and late-night parties with a drink always close at hand, blurring the line between movie star and rock star. Though in recent years Depp has tried to tone it down, his turbulent personal life, especially his highly publicized and messy divorce, pulled the curtain back on just how extreme his drinking once was. Friends say he's mellowed, but the stories of wild nights, endless bottles, and rock and roll chaos will always be part of the Johnny Depp legend. Lindsay Lohan. Lindsay Lohan was once Hollywood's golden girl, a child star turned teen idol with hits like Mean Girls and Freaky Friday. But as the spotlight grew, so did the temptations. In her 20s, Lohan's life became a blur of clubs, vodka, and endless paparazzi flashbulbs. Almost nightly, she was photographed stumbling out of hotspots like Chateau Marmont or Les Deux, earning her a reputation as one of the era's biggest party girls. Her drinking spiraled into legal trouble. Multiple DUIs, failed sobriety tests, and repeated court appearances turned her career into tabloid fodder. Judges ordered her into rehab more than once, but she often relapsed, and production suffered. Movies stalled, directors complained, and the industry began to turn its back. Still, Lohan never disappeared completely. She remained in headlines, whether for partying in Europe or brief attempts at comebacks. In recent years, she's tried to rebuild, launching businesses, moving abroad, and returning to acting on streaming platforms. But the scars of her party years remain. To fans, Lindsay Lohan will always be a symbol of Hollywood's dangerous cycle. How fast the industry can lift a star up, and how quickly alcohol and fame can bring them crashing down. Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen's Hollywood career was already huge. Platoon, Wall Street, and later TV juggernaut 2.5 Men. But in 2011, his private demons exploded into one of the most infamous public meltdowns in entertainment history. Fueled by round-the-clock vodka binges and drugs, Sheen went on a rampage of wild interviews, bizarre catchphrases, and non-stop partying. He trashed hotel rooms, surrounded himself with goddesses and models, and declared himself a warlock with tiger blood and Adonis DNA. The rants made headlines worldwide and turned Sheen into tabloid gold, but also cost him his $2 million an episode sitcom job, the highest paid role in TV at the time. Behind the spectacle, friends and family watched in fear. His drinking and drug use had been a problem for decades. Rehab stints, arrests, and hospitalizations were nothing new. But 2011 was the year it all went nuclear. These days, Sheen has kept a much lower profile, focusing on family and health. But his wild spiral remains one of the most unforgettable Hollywood flameouts ever. Proof of how booze, fame, and ego can collide in spectacular fashion.